In the heart of London, behind the gilded gates of Kensington Palace, two of the world's most watched individuals were planning something that would change everything. Not a state visit, not a charity gala, not another carefully orchestrated public appearance, but a simple, spontaneous adventure that would remind them why they fell in love in the first place. What started as a whispered conversation over morning tea would become the most talked-about royal escapade in decades, proving that sometimes the best surprises come from the most unexpected places. The morning mist hung low over the palace gardens as Catherine stood by the tall windows of their private sitting room, watching the gardeners tend to the rose bushes below. The familiar weight of routine pressed against her shoulders like an invisible cloak. Another day of scheduled appearances, carefully worded statements, and the constant awareness that every move would be photographed, analyzed, and discussed by millions. William entered quietly, carrying 2 steaming cups of Earl Grey, a small ritual they had maintained throughout their years of marriage despite the chaos that often surrounded their lives. He noticed the way her shoulders curved slightly inward, a subtle sign he had learned to recognize over the years. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, settling beside her on the window seat that had become their unofficial morning sanctuary. Catherine accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm porcelain. "Do you remember," she began slowly, "that weekend we spent in the Highlands, just after we were engaged? No security detail following us from room to room, no photographers hiding in the bushes. Just us, that little cottage, and the most spectacular sunset I've ever seen." William's expression softened as the memory surfaced. They had managed to slip away for exactly 36 hours before duty called them back. It had been one of the last times they had felt completely ordinary, completely free. The cottage with the broken heating, he remembered with a smile. "We spent the entire evening huddled under every blanket we could find, playing cards by candlelight. And you let me win at poker." "I most certainly did not let you win. You're just naturally gifted at deception." Catherine laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in weeks. But, as the moment passed, she found herself staring out at the gardens again, watching their perfectly manicured beauty with a sense of longing she couldn't quite name. "William," she said suddenly, turning to face him with an intensity that made him set down his cup. "What if we just disappeared for a night?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. William's first instinct was to list all the reasons why such a thing would be impossible. The security protocols, the packed schedule, the dozens of people who depended on knowing their whereabouts at every moment. But something in Catherine's eyes stopped him. "Disappear how?" he asked instead. Catherine's mind began racing with possibilities she hadn't dared consider in years. What if we could spend one night being completely ordinary people? No titles, no protocols, no one watching our every move. Just a husband and wife exploring their own country like tourists. The idea should have seemed impossible, but William found himself caught up in her enthusiasm. When was the last time they had made a decision purely because they wanted to, without consulting advisors or considering public perception? "We would need help," he said slowly, and Catherine felt her heart leap at the word "we." "Someone we trust completely." "Harry," Catherine said immediately. "He's done his share of creative escaping over the years." William nodded thoughtfully. His younger brother had indeed become something of an expert at evading royal protocols when the mood struck him. If anyone could help them plan a successful disappearing act, it would be Harry. The conversation that followed was whispered and hurried, filled with the giddiness of teenagers planning to sneak out after curfew. They debated locations, timing, and cover stories with the same intensity they usually reserve for matters of state. The Lake District was too remote, Scotland too obvious, London too risky. But somewhere in the middle of England, somewhere they could blend in and explore without recognition, that held promise. By the time their private secretary knocked to remind them of their first appointment, they had the skeleton of a plan that seemed equal parts brilliant and completely mad. Catherine felt more energized than she had in months, while William found himself looking at their official schedule with new eyes, calculating exactly what they could rearrange or delegate. The day proceeded with its usual rhythm of meetings, phone calls, and public appearances. Catherine opened a new wing of a children's hospital with her characteristic warmth and genuine interest, while William met with environmental advisors about upcoming conservation initiatives. To the outside world, it was another ordinary day in the life of the royal couple. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. During a brief break between engagements, Catherine found herself researching small English market towns on her phone, reading about local pubs and bed and breakfasts with the fascination of someone discovering a foreign country. William, meanwhile, discreetly contacted Harry, who listened to the proposal with growing delight and immediately began offering increasingly elaborate suggestions for disguises and cover stories. "You realize," Harry said during their hushed phone conversation, "that if this goes wrong, Mother will have both our heads. And if it goes right," William replied, "we might remember why we fell in love with this country in the first place." As evening fell over Kensington Palace, Catherine and William found themselves back in their sitting room, this time with a notebook filled with hastily scribbled plans and a feeling that they were standing on the edge of something extraordinary. The routine that had felt suffocating that morning now seemed like a launching pad for adventure. Outside their windows, London continued its eternal dance of lights and movement, unaware that two of its most famous residents were planning to step off the stage of public life, even if only for a few precious hours. The world would wake up tomorrow expecting to find the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge where they always were, perfectly presented, thoroughly scheduled, and completely predictable. What the world would discover instead would surprise everyone, perhaps none more than William and Catherine themselves. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made London feel alive with possibility. Catherine woke before her alarm, her mind immediately racing with the plans they had finalized the night before. Beside her, William was already awake, staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone either about to embark on a grand adventure or commit a spectacular act of rebellion. "Second thoughts," Catherine whispered. "Third and fourth thoughts," William admitted. But no change of heart. They had exactly 18 hours to execute what Harry had dubbed Operation Ordinary, a window of opportunity created by the fortunate coincidence of a canceled evening engagement and a rare gap in their weekend schedule. It wasn't much time, but it was more freedom than they had experienced in years. The plan they had devised was elegantly simple in concept, if terrifying in execution. They would slip away during the transition between their afternoon commitments and evening dinner, when their security detail typically relaxed slightly and their staff assumed they were safely ensconced in private family time. Harry would provide both transportation and alibi, while a trusted friend from Catherine's university days would supply accommodation in the small Cotswolds village of Chipping Campden. Catherine's first challenge came during her morning engagement at a local school, where she was launching a new literacy program. Usually, such events energized her, but today she found herself distracted by the clock on the classroom wall and the mental checklist of everything they needed to accomplish before their escape window opened. "Your Royal Highness," asked a particularly precocious 7-year-old named Emma, "why do you look different today?" Catherine paused, caught off guard by the child's directness. "Different how, Emma?" "You look like my mum does when she's planning a surprise party," the little girl explained matter-of-factly. All buzzy and secretive. The observation was so accurate that Catherine nearly laughed out loud. Instead, she knelt down to Emma's level and whispered conspiratorially, "Can you keep a secret?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Sometimes grown-ups need their own kind of surprise parties," Catherine said. "The kind where you remember how to have fun." Meanwhile, across London, William was enduring what felt like the longest environmental briefing in history, nodding thoughtfully at discussions of carbon footprints and renewable energy while his mind calculated travel times and worried about weather forecasts. When his private secretary mentioned that the evening's dinner with the Swedish ambassador had been postponed due to a family emergency, William managed to express appropriate concern while internally celebrating what felt like divine intervention. The afternoon brought the most delicate part of their plan, the actual escape. Catherine returned to Kensington Palace at precisely 3:30 p.m., ostensibly for a quiet family afternoon. William arrived moments later, greeting the household staff with casual mentions of wanting an early night and perhaps ordering in Chinese food. Their security team, accustomed to the couple's occasional desire for privacy, settled into their usual evening routines. At 4:15 p.m., Harry appeared at the palace's service entrance, driving an unremarkable blue sedan that belonged to a friend of a friend. He wore dark glasses and a baseball cap pulled low over his face, looking for all the world like someone trying very hard not to be recognized, which ironically made him blend in perfectly among London's many celebrities attempting the same feat. Catherine had spent considerable time perfecting her disguise, choosing clothes she hadn't worn since her university days: dark jeans, a simple sweater, and a wool coat that had no distinguishing features whatsoever. She had pulled her hair back into a messy bun and worn minimal makeup, hoping to achieve the kind of casual anonymity she remembered from her pre-royal life. William's transformation was even more dramatic. Gone were the perfectly tailored suits and formal bearing that had become his public uniform. Instead, he wore corduroys and a weather jacket, had mussed his hair deliberately, and adopted the slightly slouched posture of someone with no particular place to be, and no one watching his every move. The actual moment of departure felt surreal. They slipped out through the palace's lesser-used garden entrance, a route typically reserved for deliveries and staff arrivals. Catherine felt her heart pounding as they crossed the courtyard, half expecting to hear shouts or alarm bells. But the afternoon remained peacefully quiet. Harry was waiting with the engine running and an enormous grin on his face. "Your chariot awaits," he said with exaggerated formality as they climbed into the back seat. Destination, freedom. As they pulled away from Kensington Palace, Catherine watched the familiar buildings shrink in the rear window and felt a sensation she hadn't experienced in years: the thrill of the unknown. They were actually doing it. For the next 24 hours, they would be nobody special, going nowhere important, with nothing more pressing to worry about than where to have dinner. The drive through London's afternoon traffic felt like a journey between worlds. In the palace, every minute was accounted for, every destination predetermined. But sitting in Harry's borrowed car, watching ordinary people go about their ordinary lives, Catherine felt a freedom that was almost dizzying. "You know," William said as they navigated through the busy streets, "I haven't sat in the back of a normal car in years. No partition, no security protocols, no predetermined route. It's rather nice, isn't it?" Catherine replied, watching a family at a bus stop, the children arguing over a bag of sweets while their mother checked her phone. Such a simple scene, yet it felt exotic to her now. Harry, who was enjoying his role as getaway driver immensely, regaled them with stories of his own escapes over the years. There was the time he had spent a weekend camping in Wales with friends who didn't learn his identity until they saw him on the news the following Monday, and the memorable evening when he had joined a pub quiz team in Cornwall and helped them win by contributing knowledge about military history that his teammates assumed came from an unusually thorough education. As London gave way to countryside, Catherine felt herself relaxing in a way she hadn't for months. The autumn landscape rolled past their windows in a tapestry of gold and amber, punctuated by small villages that looked like illustrations from children's books. This was the England she had fallen in love with during her university years, the England that existed beyond state dinners and official residences. Their destination, Chipping Campden, was exactly the kind of village that appeared on postcards and travel brochures. Its honey-colored stone buildings lined streets that had been walked by merchants and travelers for over 1,000 years. Catherine's university friend, Sarah, had moved there 5 years earlier with her husband and 2 children, trading a high-powered job in London for a life that prioritized peace over prestige. Sarah was waiting for them at her cottage door, her face reflecting the same mixture of excitement and disbelief that Catherine felt. She had agreed to help with their plan without asking too many questions, understanding instinctively that sometimes even the most public people needed to disappear. "Well," Sarah said as she hugged Catherine in her front garden, "this is certainly the most interesting request for accommodation I've ever received." The cottage was everything Catherine had hoped for: small, cozy, and absolutely ordinary. The sitting room was filled with comfortable furniture that had been chosen for family life rather than photographs. The kitchen table bore the honest scars of homework sessions and art projects, and the whole place smelled of baking bread and autumn flowers. As Harry prepared to leave them to their adventure, he pulled William aside for a moment of brotherly advice. "You know, this is exactly the sort of thing that either goes brilliantly or becomes a disaster we're all talking about for the next decade," he said. "I know," William replied, "but it's been years since we did something purely because we wanted to. We've forgotten what that feels like." Harry nodded, understanding completely. "Well then," he said, "forget responsibly," as his car disappeared down the village's main street. William and Catherine found themselves truly alone for the first time in longer than either could remember. Standing in the doorway of a stranger's cottage, wearing clothes that made them feel like different people, they looked at each other and began to laugh. The sun was setting over Chipping Camden, painting the ancient stone buildings in shades of gold and pink. Somewhere in London, their staff was probably beginning to wonder where they were. Tomorrow, there would be questions to answer and schedules to rearrange. But tonight, they were just a couple on an unexpected adventure, with nowhere to be and nothing to prove. The Great Escape had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Evening in Chipping Camden brought the kind of peace that Catherine had almost forgotten existed. After Sarah had given them a quick tour of the cottage and departed with promises to check on them in the morning, William and Catherine found themselves alone in a way they hadn't experienced in years. The cottage was a study in comfortable living. Mismatched furniture that had been chosen for comfort rather than style, bookshelves packed with well-read novels and children's stories, and windows that framed views of the village rather than manicured palace grounds. Catherine ran her fingers along the worn wooden table in the kitchen and felt a surprising wave of nostalgia for the simple flat she had shared with friends during university. Right then, William said, opening the refrigerator that Sarah had thoughtfully stocked for their visit, "What shall we have for dinner? And please don't say whatever cook has prepared, because I have a feeling cook is about 60 miles away and probably wondering where we've gone." Catherine laughed, pulling out ingredients with the enthusiasm of someone rediscovering a forgotten skill. "How do you feel about pasta? I haven't cooked properly in years, but I used to make a decent carbonara. I feel like pasta made by my wife sounds infinitely better than another formal dinner where I have to remember which fork to use for which course," William replied, rolling up his sleeves with theatrical determination. What followed was perhaps the most chaotic and joyful cooking experience either of them had had since their early married life. William proved to be enthusiastic but somewhat dangerous with kitchen implements, while Catherine discovered that cooking without a team of professional chefs watching required a completely different kind of confidence. The pasta sauce boiled over. William managed to splash flour across half the kitchen while attempting to be helpful, and Catherine nearly burned the garlic because she was laughing too hard at his running commentary on their culinary adventure. By the time they sat down to eat, the kitchen looked like a disaster zone, but the simple meal they had created together tasted like the finest cuisine either had experienced in months. "You know," Catherine said as they ate by candlelight at the small kitchen table, "I can't remember the last time we cooked together. Actually cooked, not just posed for photographs while pretending to help professional chefs. I can't remember the last time I was allowed to make a mess," William admitted, gesturing at the flour-dusted surfaces around them. "Everything in our life is so perfectly managed, so carefully orchestrated. Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a museum where I'm both the curator and the primary exhibit." After dinner, they discovered that the cottage had no television, no internet connection strong enough for streaming, and no entertainment beyond books, board games, and conversation. For two people whose lives typically involve constant connectivity and endless information, The digital silence felt revolutionary. They settled into the sitting room with cups of tea and a worn deck of cards, falling naturally into the kind of rambling conversation they had once shared for hours during their courtship. Without the pressure of public appearance or the awareness of hidden cameras, they found themselves talking about dreams they had nearly forgotten, fears they rarely acknowledged, and hopes that had been buried under years of duty and protocol. "Do you remember," Catherine said as she dealt another hand of gin rummy, "when we used to talk about all the places we'd travel together? Not official visits with scheduled appearances and briefing books, but real traveling. Getting lost in Italian hill towns, hiking through New Zealand without anyone knowing who we were." William picked up his cards and studied them thoughtfully. "I remember thinking we had all the time in the world to do those things. Before duty called, before everyone was watching, before every spontaneous decision had to be cleared by 6 different departments. What if we did it anyway?" Catherine asked suddenly. "Not tonight, obviously, but what if we planned proper adventures? Real ones, where we could actually get lost and discover things for ourselves." The conversation that followed was filled with possibilities that seemed both impossible and absolutely necessary. They talked about places they wanted to see, experiences they wanted to have, and the people they used to be before they became symbols rather than individuals. As the evening progressed, they found themselves curled up together on the cottage's comfortable sofa, sharing a blanket and watching the fire in the small fireplace. The silence between them was comfortable and complete, broken only by the occasional crackling of logs and the distant sound of the village settling into sleep. "Catherine," William said eventually, his voice quiet in the lamplight, "when was the last time you felt completely yourself?" The question caught her off guard, but she found herself considering it seriously. "Tonight," she said after a long pause. "Right now, I feel like the person I was before all this, but also like someone I'm still becoming." "I know exactly what you mean," William replied. "It's like we've been playing roles for so long that we forgot they were roles. Tonight, I feel like I'm just me. Not the future king, not the public figure, just a man who fell in love with an extraordinary woman and somehow convinced her to marry him." The conversation drifted naturally toward their children, but even here, away from the pressures of royal parenting, they found themselves talking differently. Instead of discussing schedules and security protocols, they shared stories and dreams, worries, and hopes that had nothing to do with their children's future roles in the monarchy and everything to do with their growth as human beings. "I want them to have nights like this," Catherine said. "Not necessarily the sneaking away part, but the feeling of it. The sense that they can be ordinary whenever they need to be." "They will," William assured her. "We'll make sure of it." As midnight approached, they made their way upstairs to the cottage's master bedroom, which Sarah had prepared with fresh sheets and towels. The room was simple but charming, with exposed beams and windows that looked out over the village's sleeping rooftops. It felt like stepping into a different life, one where they were just another couple enjoying a weekend away. Lying in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of a village at night, so different from the urban hum of London, Catherine felt a profound sense of contentment. They had successfully disappeared from their public lives, if only temporarily, and in doing so had rediscovered something essential about themselves and their relationship. "William," she whispered in the darkness, "tomorrow, when we go back, let's remember this feeling." "Always," he promised, and she knew he meant it. Outside their window, Chipping Camden slept peacefully under a canopy of stars that were clearly visible away from the city's light pollution. In London, their staff would have long since assumed they were safely asleep in their palace quarters. Their security detail would be maintaining their usual vigilance around an empty apartment, while the couple they were protecting lay 60 miles away, experiencing the radical luxury of being completely anonymous. The morning would bring questions and consequences, schedules to rearrange, and explanations to provide. But tonight belonged entirely to them. Two people who had remembered what it felt like to be ordinary and in doing so had discovered something extraordinary about the life they were building together. Dawn broke over Chipping Camden with the gentle persistence of an English autumn morning, bringing with it the kind of soft light that made even the most ordinary things look touched by magic. Catherine woke slowly, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar room and the absence of her usual wake-up routine. No discreet knock from household staff, no carefully arranged schedule waiting on the bedside table, no immediate awareness of the day's public commitments pressing at the edge of her consciousness. Beside her, William was still asleep, his face relaxed in a way she rarely saw anymore. Even in their private moments at the palace, there was usually a tension around his eyes, a subtle preparation for whatever responsibility awaited. But here, in this borrowed bed in a village where no one knew who they were, he looked younger, more like the university student she had fallen in love with all those years ago. Catherine slipped quietly from the bed and padded to the window, drawing back the simple cotton curtains to reveal Chipping Camden waking up below. The view was a tableau of ordinary life that felt exotic to someone whose usual morning vista consisted of palace gardens and distant London skyline. She could see early risers walking dogs along the narrow streets, shopkeepers opening their doors for the day, and children in school uniforms hurrying past with backpacks bouncing. The normalcy of it all made her breath catch in her throat. When had she last woken up somewhere where life simply continued around her without any awareness of her presence? When had she last been able to stand at a window without wondering if someone was watching her watching the world? A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "That'll be Sarah with breakfast," William said, having awakened to find her at the window. "She mentioned something about proper English breakfast to set us up for our adventure, though I'm not entirely sure what adventure she had in mind." Sarah arrived bearing a tray laden with the kind of hearty breakfast that had sustained English countryside dwellers for generations. Eggs, bacon, sausages, grilled tomatoes, and thick slices of homemade bread still warm from the oven. She also brought news that would shape their unexpected day. "There's a harvest festival in the next village over," she explained as she set the tray on the small table by the window. "Wickham's been preparing for months. There'll be traditional music, local crafts, proper countryside games, and the sort of community spirit that makes you remember why these villages have survived for centuries. I thought you might enjoy experiencing it, if you're brave enough." The suggestion hung in the air between possibility and impossibility. Attending a local festival meant prolonged contact with strangers, increased chance of recognition, and the kind of spontaneous interaction that their security protocols were specifically designed to prevent. It was exactly the sort of thing they never would have considered in their normal lives. How many people usually attend?" Catherine asked, her mind already calculating risks and possibilities. "Oh, a few hundred, I'd say. Families from all the surrounding villages, some tourists who've discovered it online, local farmers showing off their prized vegetables. Very relaxed, very friendly. The sort of place where everyone's too busy enjoying themselves to pay much attention to strangers." William and Catherine exchanged a look that communicated volumes. They had successfully escaped for one night, proven to themselves that they could disappear when they needed to. They could return to London now, mission accomplished, with memories to sustain them through future periods of official routine. Or they could push their luck, extend their experiment in ordinary life, and see what it felt like to be completely anonymous in a crowd of their own countrymen. "We need to be careful," William said slowly, and Catherine felt her heart jump at the implicit agreement in his words. "Very careful," Catherine agreed, "and probably very lucky." After Sarah left them to their breakfast and their decision, they sat by the window eating and planning with a mixture of excitement and terror that marked all their best decisions together. The festival would be a test of their disguises, their ability to blend in, and their capacity for the kind of spontaneous interaction that had become foreign to their carefully managed lives. Catherine chose her outfit with the precision of a spy preparing for a mission. Jeans that had seen enough were to look authentically lived in, a simple cardigan that would blend with any crowd, and a scarf that could be adjusted to partially conceal her face if recognition seemed imminent. She plaited her hair in a simple braid and wore the kind of understated makeup that suggested someone who had made an effort without trying too hard. William's transformation was equally careful, but more dramatic. He had packed a worn baseball cap and glasses with plain frames that changed the shape of his face significantly, combined with clothes borrowed from Sarah's husband, who was fortunately similar in size, and a deliberate adjustment to his usually perfect posture, he achieved a remarkable ordinariness. The drive to Wickham took them through countryside that seemed designed to illustrate everything beautiful about England in autumn. Golden fields stretched toward distant hills, hedgerows blazed with berries and changing leaves, and the small villages they passed through looked like settings for the kind of stories that made people fall in love with the idea of English country life. They could hear the festival before they saw it, the sound of traditional music mixing with laughter and conversation, the calls of vendors selling everything from hand-knitted scarves to apple cider, and the general buzz of a community celebrating together. The festival was being held in and around Wickham's village green, with stalls arranged in cheerful chaos and stages set up for various performances. Catherine felt her nervousness spike as they approached the crowds. What if someone recognized them? What if their disguises weren't as effective as they had hoped? What if their presence somehow disrupted or overshadowed what was clearly a beloved community tradition? But as they joined the stream of people entering the festival grounds, something remarkable happened. They simply became part of the crowd. Families with children were too focused on managing excited youngsters to study strangers' faces. Elderly couples were absorbed in conversations with old friends. Teenagers were clustered around game booths and food stalls with a self-absorption that made them oblivious to anyone over 25. "It's working," William murmured as they walked past a ring of Morris dancers without attracting so much as a second glance. "We're actually invisible." Their first stop was a stall selling traditional crafts, where Catherine found herself genuinely interested in the hand-thrown pottery, and William discovered a fascination with woodworking techniques he had never had the opportunity to observe up close. The craftspeople were happy to explain their processes to interested visitors, treating William and Catherine exactly as they would any other festival goers. "Been doing pottery for 40 years, explained Mrs. Henderson, a cheerful woman whose hands bore the honest stains of her craft. "Started as a hobby when the children were small, but it's become my passion. There's something about creating something useful and beautiful with your own hands that never gets old." Catherine found herself drawn into a genuine conversation about the meditative aspects of creative work, sharing thoughts about art and creativity that she rarely had the opportunity to express in her public role. Mrs. Henderson had no idea she was discussing aesthetics with someone whose every public appearance was analyzed by style experts, and Catherine reveled in the pure exchange of ideas without underlying agenda or interpretation. Meanwhile, William had discovered a demonstration of traditional blacksmithing and was watching with genuine fascination as a master craftsman shaped red-hot metal into functional tools. The physical nature of the work, the direct relationship between skill and result, appealed to something in him that had been dormant for years. "Would you like to try?" the blacksmith asked, noticing William's intense attention. "It's not as easy as it looks, but most folks enjoy giving it a go." For a moment, William hesitated. The idea of trying something so completely outside his usual experience, in front of strangers, without the safety net of expertise or preparation, felt both thrilling and terrifying. But then he looked at Catherine, who was nodding encouragement, and decided that this day was about saying yes to possibilities. The next hour passed in a blur of new experiences that felt like small revelations. William discovered that blacksmithing required a completely different kind of focus than anything in his royal education, while Catherine joined a group learning traditional folk dances and found herself laughing harder than she had in months as she attempted steps that were more complex than they appeared. They ate lunch from paper plates while sitting on hay bales, listening to a local band play songs that had been sung in these villages for generations. The food was simple but delicious: locally sourced sausages, bread baked that morning, apple cider pressed from fruit grown in nearby orchards. It was the kind of meal that connected them directly to the land and community around them. You know, Catherine said as she watched children playing traditional games that had probably been enjoyed on this same green for centuries. I had forgotten that England was more than state dinners and official ceremonies. This is the England I fell in love with during university. The England of village traditions and genuine community spirit. The England that exists beyond the headlines, William agreed. The England of ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply because they care about their communities and their heritage. As the afternoon progressed, they found themselves becoming not just observers, but participants in the festival's community spirit. They helped judge a vegetable competition, carefully avoiding any categories that might require expertise they would be expected to have, joined in groups singing of traditional songs, Catherine's music training proving surprisingly helpful, and even participated in some of the festival games with the kind of enthusiastic incompetence that made them fit right in. The revelation of the day wasn't that they could successfully disguise themselves or even that they could enjoy ordinary pleasures. It was the discovery that their country was full of people whose warmth, creativity, and community spirit made them incredibly proud to be connected to these lives, even if that connection was temporary and anonymous. As evening approached and the festival began to wind down, William and Catherine found themselves reluctant to leave. They had experienced something that felt essential to their understanding of themselves and their role, something that couldn't be captured in official visits or carefully choreographed public appearances. But London was waiting, reality was calling, and they both knew that their experiment in ordinary life would soon have to end. The question was, what would they take with them from this remarkable day, and how would it change the way they approached their very extraordinary lives? The drive back to London felt like a journey between worlds, each mile bringing them closer to a reality that now seemed both more manageable and more meaningful than when they had left it. The autumn countryside that had welcomed them with anonymity now bid them farewell with the golden light of late afternoon, as if the landscape itself had been part of their conspiracy to rediscover themselves. Catherine found herself memorizing details she wanted to preserve, the way the light fell across William's face as he drove, finally, relaxed and unhurried. The sight of village after village where people live complete lives without ever appearing in newspapers or having their every decision analyzed by experts. The feeling of being completely present in moments that belonged entirely to them. I keep thinking about Mrs. Henderson, Catherine said as they passed through a small town where the shops were closing for the day and families were walking home together. The way she talked about pottery, about creating something useful and beautiful with her own hands. I can't remember the last time someone spoke to me about their passion without considering how I might help promote it or what official connection I might provide. William nodded, understanding completely. Or that blacksmith who taught me to shape metal. He wasn't performing for anyone, wasn't trying to impress. He was just sharing something he loved with someone who was interested. When was the last time we experienced that kind of authentic human connection? They had both been changed by their brief experiment in ordinary life, but the nature of that change was only beginning to reveal itself. It wasn't simply that they had enjoyed being anonymous, though they had, or that they had rediscovered their capacity for spontaneity, though that too had been revelatory. It was something deeper, a reconnection with the people and country they served that had become abstract in their daily lives of protocols and procedures. As London's skyline appeared on the horizon, they began the delicate process of transitioning back to their public selves. William straightened his posture almost unconsciously, while Catherine checked her reflection in the visor mirror and began the mental shift from anonymous festival-goer back to Duchess. But something felt different about the transformation this time. Instead of putting on a costume, it felt like they were adding layers to people who remained fundamentally themselves. Their first stop was Harry's flat, where their brother-in-law was waiting with fresh clothes, knowing smiles, and approximately 1,000 questions about their adventure. The borrowed car that had served as their chariot to freedom would be returned to its owner with thanks and a story that would probably be told for years. "Well," Harry demanded before they were even properly through the door, "don't keep me in suspense. Did you successfully disappear? Were you recognized? Did you remember how to be normal human beings? Or has royal life permanently broken your ability to function in the real world?" The questions tumbled out of him with the enthusiasm of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of escaping royal obligations and was genuinely invested in their success. William and Catherine looked at each other and began to laugh, the kind of exhausted, exhilarated laughter that follows a perfectly executed adventure. "We made pottery," Catherine announced, as if this was the most remarkable achievement imaginable. "Well, I watched pottery being made, and William actually tried blacksmithing, with real fire and everything. And we danced," William added. "Traditional folk dances that I definitely did not know how to do. In public, with actual people watching." Harry's grin grew wider with each revelation. "You danced? Publicly?" "Badly. Catastrophically," William confirmed. "And it was wonderful." The debrief that followed was filled with the kind of detail that made their adventure feel real and permanent. They told Harry about the festival, about the conversations with strangers, about the feeling of being completely unremarkable in a crowd of their own countrymen. They described the cottage, the meal they had cooked together, the village waking up around them without any awareness of their presence. But more than the specific events, they tried to communicate the feeling of the experience, the sense of freedom, the reconnection with each other, the reminder of why they had fallen in love, not just with each other, but with the country they would someday help to lead. "You know," Harry said thoughtfully after hearing their stories, "Mother always said that the best way to serve the people was to understand them. Not just meet them in formal settings or read reports about their lives, but actually understand what makes them laugh, what they worry about, what they value. You two have just had a masterclass in understanding." As evening fell and it came time to return to Kensington Palace, William and Catherine felt a mixture of sadness at leaving their adventure behind and anticipation about integrating what they had learned into their ongoing life. They had proven to themselves that they could still be ordinary when they needed to be, that their relationship could survive and thrive outside the context of royal duty, and that England was full of people whose lives and values aligned beautifully with their own hopes for the monarchy's future. The palace, when they finally returned, looked exactly the same as when they had left it, but their perception of it had shifted fundamentally. Instead of seeing it as a beautiful prison where every movement was watched and regulated, they now saw it as a base of operations for serving people they had spent 2 days getting to know in an entirely new way. Their staff, who had spent a somewhat anxious weekend trying not to openly wonder where their employers had gone, greeted them with the kind of professional discretion that pretended nothing unusual had happened while clearly burning with curiosity about their absence. Catherine and William answered questions vaguely, mentioned a private family matter that had required their attention, and Libby understood that some things were not for public discussion. But privately, as they settled back into their familiar routines, they found themselves changed in ways both subtle and profound. Catherine approached her next official engagement, a visit to a community center in East London, with a different kind of attention, listening not just for problems she might help solve, but for evidence of the same community spirit they had witnessed in Wickham. She found it everywhere, in volunteers who reminded her of Mrs. Henderson and young people whose enthusiasm echoed the festival dancers. William discovered that his environmental meetings took on new meaning when he thought about the farmers he had met, people whose connection to the land was immediate and practical rather than theoretical. The policies they were discussing would affect real people whose faces he could now visualize, whose concerns he had heard expressed in their own words rather than filtered through reports and briefings. Their evening routine, too, had been transformed by their brief experiment in ordinary life. They found themselves cooking together more often, choosing simple meals over formal dining when their schedules permitted. They talked differently about their children's futures, considering not just their royal roles, but their need to understand and connect with the people they would someday serve. Most importantly, they had established a precedent that would guide them through the years ahead. They had proven that they could disappear when they needed to, that their relationship could thrive outside the context of duty and protocol, and that England was full of people worth knowing in ways that had nothing to do with official ceremonies or state occasions. The adventure that had begun as a desperate attempt to escape routine had become something much more significant, a reminder of why their work mattered, and a source of strength that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. They had gone looking for freedom and found purpose, had sought to escape their roles, and instead discovered new ways to fulfill them. And in a cottage in Chipping Campden, Sarah was already planning to preserve the guest room exactly as they had left it, understanding that some visitors might need to return to the place where they had remembered how to be themselves. As Catherine fell asleep that night in her own bed, surrounded by the familiar comfort of home, she found herself already planning their next escape. Not because she wanted to run away from her life, but because she now understood that occasionally disappearing was the best way to remember why she had chosen this extraordinary existence in the first place. Outside their windows, London hummed with the lives of millions of people who would wake up tomorrow and go about their business, most of them unaware that their future monarchs had spent the weekend learning to see them, and themselves, with completely new eyes. The England they would someday help to lead was more beautiful, more complex, and more worth serving than they had ever imagined. And that, perhaps, was the greatest surprise of all.